Okay, welcome back everybody. We are going to be doing a special video today going over Diablo 4 damage breakdowns. Diablo 4 is kind of complicated when it comes to how damage is calculated. So what I wanted to do was make a video to help people understand how to calculate out their damage, because it's not as simple as it seems, and it seems pretty hard. To start off, we want to talk about the different damage types and how your ability calculates damage, and then what other modifiers exist for it. So to give you an overview, damage exists, or the way that damage is calculated exists in, we'll say, like 3 different buckets. Okay, one aspect of that is your weapon damage, how much your weapon says it hits for. So you can see that this one is 522 DPS. A second bucket is called additive damage, which are the other stats that are underneath that. You can say this one, for instance, it has plus 9% damage to crowd-controlled enemies, plus 24% overpower damage, plus 9.5% damage to stunned enemies, etc., etc. And then the third damage bucket is multiplicative damage, which usually is pretty rare, but it does exist in, like, skills, for instance. So, like, for instance, this one here, after critically striking 10 times with bone skills, your bone skills deal an extra 15% multiplicative. You see that X there? That means it's a multiplier. So we're going to go through how each one of these is calculated out, and I'll try to show you guys examples of each of them, but we're going to do it in steps. We're not going to do it all at once. And we'll also talk about things like critical strikes, vulnerable damage, all of that stuff as well, but that'll be a little bit later on. So the first thing that you want to do when you're trying to calculate out your damage is to go into your options. You want to go into gameplay, and you want to turn this on right here, advanced tooltip information. This, as it says right there, it shows you what damage breakdown it belongs to, whether it's additive, whether it's multiplicative. It also gets to show you how your stats rolled on an item. So for instance, you can see on this one, the damage to crowd controlled enemies is at 9%, and on this, it could have rolled anywhere from 6 to 9.5. So it's a pretty decent roll as far as that's concerned. I just have some random item turned on. Before I get into everything, to make things more simplified, I don't really have any abilities. I don't have any of my Paragon stuff learned. I obviously don't have any equipment on except for this weapon, and that's just to really simplify it out because it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. So the first damage that we want to calculate, we'll call this base damage, is your weapon damage as it pertains to your skill. So the skill that we're going to be looking at, you can see it here, is Bone Spear. And when you read it, you can see it conjures a Bone Spear from the ground, dealing some amount of damage, but that 119%, that's the important part. The 119% is referring to your weapon, so it takes 119% of your weapon's DPS. So if you do the math, 119% of 522 comes out to, I actually have it here, 621. 621, however, is not listed on this weapon, which is a bit confusing at first. Why is that? And what are these numbers that are here? 559 and 683. 621, if you add 10% to it, is 683. If you lower it by 10%, it's 559. So it gives you this minus plus 10% range. And that's kind of what you're going to be looking at for your skills. So essentially, you can break this down into the higher your DPS, the higher your skill damage is going to be. This takes into account as well your attacks per second. Some skills, this doesn't matter because it has a standardized like animation, and it's not faster or slower for your attacks per second. It's just whatever that skill is. I don't know which ones those are, but I know that they exist. But for our purposes, we have 621. So that's the median damage for Bone Spear. And then we get the 10% up and down sort of range. Fantastic. That's all well and good. But now, how does our damage get affected from there? The next bucket that we're going to look at, so after you calculate your base damage, you get your additive damage. And additive damage is all of these plus 9% this, plus 9.5% that. You also want to take a look at your intelligence. Your intelligence increases skill damage, for instance. Mine is increasing it by 9.9%. All of that is considered additive. So the way that you would calculate this out is after you get your base damage, your percentage off of your weapon damage, you then want to multiply it out. I'll have the formula up on the screen, but it comes out to base damage. You multiply that by 1 plus whatever the additive percentages are. So in this case, it would be multiplied by 1 plus 9%, 9.5%, and 9.9% from my skills here. I'm ignoring the overpower one for now, but obviously that only applies if those conditions are met. So assuming I meet all of the conditions here, let's say the enemy I'm attacking is crowd controlled and it's stunned, it's both of them, then I would get both the 9% and 9.5%. And then I always get my skill damage from my ability, so that's 9.9%. I can actually break that down for you. I have a little spreadsheet that I created just handy for this here. Ba-bam! Look at this. Math already done. It's like I'm prepared or something. So you can see here, this is our base weapon damage. You have our average. There's our minus 10 and plus 10%. And then we have our intelligence multiplier, crowd controlled multiplier, and stunned multiplier, which is 9.9, 9, and 9.5 respectively. And you can see what the contribution is total. And this is the total damage that it will be adding together. So if I meet all of these requirements, I will deal a total of 798 damage on average using this 621 ability. That's all well and good. So additive damage, that's how it works. It all adds together and then it's applied to your damage. So additive damage is the most common one that you're going to find. It's going to be on most of your items will have some amount of additive damage on it. But really what you want to try and look for in what a lot of the specializations kind of revolve around is multiplicative damage. You want your damage to multiply out afterwards. So again, if we look at our abilities, we're taking this one into consideration. Compound Fracture. Again, this is just for necromancers. Each class has their own multiplier somewhere. Assuming I trigger this, my bone skills deal 15% multiplicative increased damage for 5 seconds. So what does that mean? Well, that means that all of this, the base damage plus the additive damage, it gets increased by a flat 15%. Essentially, it is all of that damage. The number is just going to be 15% larger. So multiplicative damage is huge. It's really, really big because it gets all of your additive benefits first. It gets all of your base weapon damage first, and then it multiplies that whole number. And so that's where you're going to start seeing some really, really, really large numbers, some really large contribution, some really large modifiers. Okay, so that is essentially the breakdown of how damage works as far as base damage, additive, and multiplicative. There are some exceptions. There are some tricky wordings with certain things. Essentially, you can break it down to if it has a plus next to it, that's additive damage. If it just has an X next to it, that's multiplicative. Now that that's all out of the way, we can talk about vulnerable damage, we can talk about critical damage, and we can talk about overpower damage. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is vulnerable damage. There are skills, there are abilities that you can get that will make enemies vulnerable, and that's when you turn their health bars purple. At a core, vulnerable enemies take 20% more damage. So that's multiplicative. So you're just increasing the amount of damage that they take by 20%. So that's very good. Making enemies vulnerable, it essentially just multiplies your damage by 20%. When you see abilities that increase damage to vulnerable enemies, this one, for instance, increases it by 16.5%. That means that I'm just going to be doing 36.5% multiplicative damage to vulnerable enemies. Even though it has that plus there, this is where it gets a little confusing. Even though that plus is there, that's actually adding to your multiplicative damage. So that's really good. If your class, for instance, the spec I'm playing, Bone Spears, it's all about making enemies vulnerable, dealing more damage to vulnerable enemies. That's just huge numbers going to be happening there. So it's a very important stat for my class, for instance. It might not be for yours. If you don't have a way to make an enemy vulnerable, then this is kind of useless for you. The second type of kind of damage modifier is critical strikes. Okay, and there's two numbers that we're concerned with, and you can see it under the stats. You have critical strike chance, and then critical strike damage. Okay, every character starts with 5% critical strike chance, and every character starts with 50% critical strike damage. You can make both of these numbers higher. So basically, when you critically strike, you are multiplying your damage by the critical strike damage number, whatever that percentage is. So right now, my critical strike chance is 6.3%. If I get that, then my damage will be multiplied by 59%, and I can make that higher with gear. One thing that's important to know is that Critical strikes can only happen on direct damage. They cannot happen on dots. So if your class is damage over time, if it does bleeds, if it does poisons, if it does like shadow damage, there's a necromancer spec, for instance, that's all damage over time shadow stuff, critical strike is worthless for you. It's absolutely wasted, and the least of it's a completely dead stat. It's not important at all. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at specializations to play or looking for gearing. And the third type of damage ability, if you will, is Overpower. Overpower currently cannot be changed. There's nothing that makes this higher. It will always be 3%. You start with 3%, and I have not seen anything that makes it higher than that. There are abilities and skills that will force you to do Overpower damage, but that doesn't affect the chance at all. Your chance is always 3%, and you've probably seen it if you've played a decent amount of Diablo 4. It's whenever your damage goes teal. So if you see critical strikes, that's orange. And if you see overpower, that's teal. Overpower damage is calculated off of your HP. So essentially, after all the modifiers, if everything has been calculated out, overpower damage kicks in, and it just adds overpower damage to your attack. It doesn't multiply anything out. It's kind of its own separate thing. It's its own separate formula that's worked out that goes off of your current life and your fortified life. The base value is 50%, but you can increase that based on whatever it is that you want to find, whatever you get. For instance, this weapon gives me plus 24% overpower damage. So if I had a specialization that was all about overpower, that would obviously be a very good stat to get. So that's essentially it. There are skills that exist that are just, like base damage, and nothing increases it unless you have something specifically that says so. That's usually like thorns. There are skills that will just do a static number of damage as well, and that's typically not increased by anything. But yeah, that's essentially it. That is the breakdown of how damage is calculated out in Diablo 4. It gets very complicated. It gets very crazy, but essentially, after all of that math, after all of that explanation, you can just break it down to trying to find out what are the most important additive damages for your specialization and trying to focus on that, and what are additive damages that are just completely worthless for you. And you can just try to go for one and try to ignore the other one. It makes gearing a lot more simplified. It makes it a lot easier to understand, because right now, I think one of the most difficult things for Diablo in general, when you're just getting started, is understanding, well, what do I need to look for in my gear? You know, I'm trying to gear up, you finish the campaign, whatever it is, you know, understanding, because there's just so many different types of additive damage as well. So just understanding that a bit more. That's all I really wanted to do, was try and provide a bit more of explanation. So good luck. Go out there. If you have any questions, feel free to comment them below. More than happy to try to explain something if it didn't make sense. I hope that helps you guys out. If there's a type of video about Diablo you'd like to see, if maybe you don't understand how armor calculations work or resistances or any of that stuff works, let me know. I would be interested in making more stuff. I like making these kind of math videos where I break things down and explain things. So hopefully that was helpful, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.